You've talked about that the media slanders you by calling you an anti-vaxxer, and you've said that you're not anti-vaccine, you're pro-safe vaccine. Difficult question. Can you name any vaccines that you think are good?
I think some of the live virus vaccines are probably averting more problems than they're causing. There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective.
Those are big words. What about the
those are big
polio?
words.
Can we talk about the?
Well, here's the problem.
Yes.
Here's the problem. The polio vaccine contained a virus called simian virus 40, SV40. It's one of the most carcinogenic materials that is known to man. In fact, it's used now by scientists around the world to induce tumors in rats and guinea pigs in labs. But it was in that vaccine. 98 million people who got that vaccine in my generation got it. And now you've had this explosion of soft tissue cancers in our generation that kill many, 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 many more people than polio ever did. So if you say to me that the polio vaccine was effective against polio, I'm going to say yes. And if you say to me, did it kill more people? Did it cause more deaths than avert? I would say I don't know because we don't have the data on that. So,
but let's talk. Well, so we kind of have to narrow in on: is it effective against the thing it's supposed to fight?
Oh well, a lot of them are. Let me give you an example. The most popular vaccine in the world is the DTP vaccine, diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. It was introduced in this country around 1980. That vaccine caused so many injuries that Wyeth, which was the manufacturer, was said to the Reagan administration, we are now paying $20 in downstream liabilities for every dollar that we're making in profits. And we are getting out of the business unless you give us permanent immunity from liability. So the vaccine companies then were given, and by the way, Reagan said at that time, why don't you just make the vaccine safe? And Wyeth said, because vaccines are inherently unsafe. They said unavoidably unsafe. You cannot make them safe. And so when Reagan wrote the bill and passed it, the bill says in its preambles, because vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. And the Brucewitz case, which was a Supreme Court case that upheld that bill, uses that same language. Vaccines cannot be made safe. They're unavoidably unsafe. So this is what the law says. Now, I just want to finish this story because this illustrates very well your question. The DTP vaccine was discontinued in this country, and it was discontinued in Europe because so many kids were being injured by it. However, the WHO and Bill Gates gives it to 161 million African children every year. And Bill Gates went to the Danish government and asked them to support this program, saying, we've saved 30 million kids from dying from diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. The Danish government said, can you show us the data? And he couldn't. So the Danish government paid for a big study with Novo Nordisk, which is a Scandinavian vaccine company, in West Africa. And they went to West Africa and they looked at the DTP vaccine for 30 years of data. And they retained the best vaccine scientists in the world, these kind of deities of African vaccine program, Peter A.A.B., Sigrid Morgensen, and a bunch of others. And they looked at 30 years of data for the DTP vaccine, and they came back and they were shocked by what they found. They found that the vaccine was preventing kids from getting diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. But the girls who got that vaccine were 10 times more likely to die over the next 6 months than children who didn't. Why is that? And they weren't dying from anything anybody ever associated with the vaccine. They were dying of anemia, bilharzia, malaria, sepsis, and mainly pulmonary and respiratory disease, pneumonia. And it turns out this is what this is what the researchers found, who were all pro-vaccine, by the way. They said that this vaccine is killing more children than diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis prior to the introduction of the vaccine. And for 30 years, nobody ever noticed it. The vaccine was providing protection against those target illnesses but it had ruined the children's immune systems, and they could not defend themselves against random infections that were harmless to most children.
But isn't it nearly impossible to prove that link?
You can't prove the link. All you can do is, for any particular interest, you can't, illness or death, you can't prove the link. But you can show statistically that that if you get that vaccine, you're more likely to die over the next 6 months than if you don't. And those studies, unfortunately, are not done for any other vaccines. So for every other medicine, in order to get approval from the FDA, you have to do a placebo-controlled trial prior to licensure, where you look at health outcomes among an exposed group, a group that gets it, and compare those to a similarly situated group that gets a placebo. The only medical intervention that does not undergo placebo-controlled trials prior to licensure are vaccines. Not one of the 72 vaccines that are now mandated for our children have ever undergone a placebo-controlled trial prior to licensure.
So I should say that there's a bunch, on that point, I've heard from a bunch of folks that disagree with you, including polio. I mean, in the testing is a really important point. Before licensure, placebo-controlled, randomized trials, polio received just that against the saline placebo control. So it seems unclear to me. I'm confused why you say that they don't go through that process. It seems like a lot of them do.
Here's the thing, is that I was saying that for many years because we couldn't find any.
Yeah.
And then in 2016, in March, I met President Trump ordered Dr. Fauci to meet with me. Mm. And Dr. Fauci and Francis Collins, and I said to them during that meeting, you have been saying that I'm not telling the truth when I said not one of these has undergone a prior pre-licensure placebo control. Mm-hmm. And the polio may have had one post-licensing. Most of them haven't. The polio may have. I don't know. But I said, our question was, prior to licensure, do you ever test these? And for safety. And by the way, I think the polio vaccine did undergo a saline placebo trial prior to licensure, but not for safety, only for efficacy. So I'm talking about safety trials. Now, Fauci told me that he said, I can't find one now. He had a whole tray of files there. He said, I can't find that one now, but I'll send you one. I said, just for any vaccine, send me one. For any of the 72 vaccines. He never did. So we sued the HHS. And after a year of stonewalling us, HHS came back and they gave us a letter saying we have no pre-licensing safety trial for any of the 72 vaccines. And that, the letter from HHS, which settled our lawsuit against them because we had a FOIA lawsuit against them, is posted on CHD's website. So anybody can go look at it. So if if HHS had any study, I assume they would have given it to us, and they can't find one.
Well, let me zoom out because a lot of the details matter here. Pre-licensure, what does placebo-controlled mean? So this is this probably requires a rigorous analysis. And actually, at this point, it would be nice for me just to give the shout out to other people much smarter than me that people should follow, along with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Use their mind, learn, and think. So one really awesome creator, I really recommend him, is Dr. Dan Wilson. He hosts the Debunk the Funk podcast. Vincent Recaniello, who hosts This Week in Virology, brilliant guy. I've had him on the podcast. Somebody you've been battling with is Paul Offit. Interesting Twitter, interesting books. People should read and understand and read your books as well. And Eric Topol has a good Twitter and good books. And even Peter Hotez, I'll ask you about him.
And people should, because Paul Offit published a Substack recently debunking, I think, my discussion with Joe Rogan. Mm-hmm. And we have published a debunk of his debunking.
Hmm.
And, so if you read his stuff, you should
Read
read,
both.
yeah,
Yes.
you should read. And I would love to debate any of these guys.
So Joe Rogan proposed just such a debate, which is quite fascinating to see how much attention and how much funding it garnered. The debate between you and Peter Hotez. Why do you think Peter rejected the offer?
I think again, I'm not going to look into his head. But what I will say is if you're a scientist and you're making public recommendations based upon what you say is evidence based science, you ought to be able to defend that. You ought to be able to defend it in a public forum, and you ought to be able to defend it against all comers. And so if you're a scientist, science is rooted in logic and reason. And if you can't use logic and reason to defend your position, and by the way, I know almost all of the studies. I've written books on them, and we've made a big effort to assemble all the studies on both sides. And so I'm prepared to talk about those studies, and I'm prepared to submit them in advance.
Hmm.
And for each of the points. And by the way, I've done that with Peter Hotez. I've actually, because I had this kind of informal debate with him several years ago with a referee at that time, and we were debating not only by phone but by email. And on those emails, every point that he would make, I would cite science, and he could never come back with science. He could never come back with publications. He would give publications that had nothing to do with, for example, thimerosal and vaccines, mercury-based vaccines. He sent me one time 16 studies to rebut something I'd said about thimerosal, and not one of those studies, they were all about the MMR vaccine, which doesn't contain thimerosal. So it wasn't like a real debate where you're using reason and isolating points and having a rational discourse. I don't think that I don't blame him for not debating me because I don't think he has the science.
Are there aspects of all the work you've done on vaccines, all the advocacy you've done, that you found out that you were not correct on, that you were wrong on, that you've changed your mind on?
Yeah, there are many times over time that I found that I've made mistakes and we correct those mistakes. I run a big organization and I do a lot of tweets. I'm very careful. For example, my Instagram, I was taken down for misinformation, but there was no misinformation on my Instagram. Everything that I cited on Instagram was cited or sourced to a government database or to peer-reviewed science. But for example, the Defender, which was our organization's newsletter, we summarize scientific reports all the time. That's one of the things, the services that we provide. So we watch the PubMed and we watch the peer-reviewed publications and we summarize them when they come out. We have made mistakes. When we make a mistake, we are rigorous about acknowledging it, apologizing for it, and changing it. That's what we do. I think we have one of the most robust fact-checking operations anywhere in journalism today. We actually do real science. And, listen, I've put up on my Twitter account when there are numerous times that I've made mistakes on Twitter and I apologize for it. And people say to me, oh, that's weird. I've never seen anybody apologize on Twitter, but I think it's really important of course, human beings make mistakes. My book is, 230 or 40, 50,000 words. There's going to be a mistake in there. But, what I say at the beginning of the book, if you see a mistake in here, please notify me. I give a way that people can notify me. And if somebody points out a mistake, I'm going to change it. I'm not going to dig my feet in and say, I'm not going to acknowledge this.
So some of the things we've been talking about, you've been an outspoken contrarian on some very controversial topics. This has garnered some fame and recognition, in part for being attacked and standing strong against those attacks. If I may say, for being a martyr. Do you worry about this drug of martyrdom that might cloud your judgment?
First of all, yeah, I don't consider myself a martyr, and I have never considered myself a victim. I make choices about my life, and I'm content with those choices and peaceful with them. I'm not trying to be a martyr or a hero or anything else. I'm doing what I think is right because I want to be peaceful inside of myself. But the only guard I have is fact-based reality. If you show me a scientific study that shows that I'm wrong, for example, if you come back and say, look, Bobby, here's a polio, here's a safety study on polio that was done pre-licensure and used a real saline solution, I'm going to put that on my Twitter and I'm going to say I was wrong. There is one out there. So, but that's all I can do.